of the Shroud of Turin. You've probably heard about it. It's the alleged burial shroud of Jesus Christ.
I know of no other historical or archaeological artifact that has had more science brought to bear on it.
I mean, if you presented this in a murder case or something, I think you'd be easily convicted with the load of evidence that we're talking about.
Yes, the image is less than a micron deep. It's about 1/50th of a human hair. Something came into contact with that cloth. Some energy, some light, some radiant source. We're talking about a pulse of light that can only be produced by a laser in the 21st century.
To discredit it, you've got to have a medieval forger who has a technique no one's ever seen before, then, or since. Then he uses human blood, Semitic-typed blood, and then he gets soil samples from Jerusalem and applies them in all the right places. And all of this starts to get to be too preposterous. My guest today is Dr. Cheryl White. But before I bring her on, I want to take a moment to address today's episode because it's a little bit outside the realm of what I'm normally talking about here on the show. And that topic is the Shroud of Turin. You've probably heard about it. It's the alleged burial shroud of Jesus Christ. Now, like a lot of people, I grew up just assuming this was a forgery, a fake, some kind of religious artifact that people wanted to believe in, but did so on no real basis. Now, I grew up in Protestant circles where it's very common to think of Catholic relics, again, as just sort of forgeries or fakes or unimportant in some way. And for Catholics out there, I mean, no offense by that, but you probably understand that tension that exists between Catholics and Protestants in regard to certain things like this. And it's just how I was raised. And it wasn't until I accidentally heard an interview about it. I was painting in my living room and I had a YouTube video on in the background. And when it ended, the next video after just sort of played automatically. And because I was covered in paint, I didn't go over there to stop it. And it happened to be an interview about the Shroud of Turin. And, initially, again, I just thought this is silly. And then within a few minutes of hearing a litany of facts I'd never heard, actual facts, scientific facts, I was stunned. And at the end of that, I went on to listen to several more interviews. And then eventually I watched some films on the topic. And that led me to want to read the probably most official book on it, which is the report on the Shroud of Turin that is the scientific report done by the STIRT team who had the opportunity to spend a week with the Shroud in 1978. And these were folks from MIT, NASA, the Jet Propulsion Lab, who all thought they were going to go there and quickly prove that it was a forgery. But at the end of that week, they came out saying, hey, we can't really explain what this is, but it's not art. It's something else. That led me to want to read several more books on it. So I just thought I'd show you a sampling of some of the books I've read on this topic. And I do that just to sort of say, this is something that I've come to take very seriously over the years. I've now consumed just countless, not only books, but many, many hours of audio and video on the topic as well. I'm pretty deep in, and I'd say that my belief is in that, high 90 percentile because the facts speak for themselves. Whatever you think it is definitely one of the most interesting artifacts on the earth. And it's one of the most scientifically and rigorously studied artifacts on the earth. I often hear it said that more scientific hours from more disciplines have been put into the study of the Shroud than any other relic or artifact on earth. So whether or not you believe that it's real, I invite you to at least hear the argument for it. And if you think it's a forgery, I invite you to explain how. Many, many have tried. No one's been able to accurately replicate it. And the fact remains that it's essentially a photograph from the ancient world. It is not art. So whether you think it's the greatest hoax of all time or you think it's a literal Easter egg that's been tucked into reality to leave a witness to the alleged events of 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem, it's up for you to decide. But I hope this is just the first of many interviews I do on this topic because, as you can probably tell from the way I'm talking about it, it's something I'm really, really passionate about. Now, like I mentioned at the beginning, my guest today is Dr. Cheryl White. She's a professor of history at Louisiana State University, where she holds the endowed Hubert Humphreys Professorship. She currently serves on the board of directors of the Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association, and she's published original research from the Vatican's secret archives on the history of the Shroud. Dr. White served as the historical consultant on the original Shroud of Turin exhibit developed for the Museum of the Bible, and she's a lecturer for the Smithsonian Institute. She's a regular consultant and contributor to the History Channel, and she's featured in a forthcoming documentary on the Shroud. She works closely with the Center for the International Study of the Shroud in Turin on collaborative projects. Her new book, The Shroud in the Third Millennium, Confronting the Limits of Human Knowledge, is available now. Dr. Cheryl White, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Daniel. Happy to be here.
Man, I couldn't be more excited to talk. My wife's been making fun of me all morning because of how excited I am, but this is a topic I'm really passionate about. I wanted to kind of start off maybe just defining this term syndenology. I think it's so fascinating that there's a whole field of research dedicated around this topic. But what is syndenology, and how did you become a syndenologist?
So syndenology comes from the both the Latin syndone, and it means, of course, burial shroud, burial linen. So syndenology is simply the study of a specific burial linen, the shroud that's held in Turin, Italy today. It's also come to be extended to another cloth that's held in Oviedo, Spain, that we may be able to talk about as well, the Sudarium of Oviedo, which is the other cloth that John mentions in his gospel in the tomb.
The one that's folded up.
Right.
You know, I grew up in Protestant churches, and so for me, the idea of relics aren't really, something that Protestants talk about or think about. And I always heard of the Shroud of Turin because all of this evidence emerged essentially during my lifetime, a lot of the scientific evidence. But It was something I just always kind of brushed off. I never really thought about it. And by chance, it was a couple of years ago, maybe a few years ago now, 2022 probably, I was painting and just put on a podcast in the background. It was about the Shroud of Turin, and I almost had a meltdown. I couldn't believe that I had not been exposed to this information and that no one had ever told me about this. Since then, and it's only been a few years, I've seen this exploding across, I guess, the podcast sphere, in all of these YouTube videos. It seems like we're in this like Renaissance moment. Tell me a little bit about how you got involved in this and what you've seen play out over these last few years, because it seems like it's an exciting time for the Shroud.
I think it's probably the most exciting time in Shroud studies in decades, literally decades. And I've been at this a very long time. So I was an undergraduate history major in the early mid-1980s when the very first peer-reviewed science began to be published about this cloth. That was all coming out of that 1978 research project. And at that time, I was pulled into the incredible mystery, and maybe not even as much as I was pulled into the mystery in 1988 when the radiocarbon dating results were published and told the whole world that it could be no older than the year 1260. Well, I was by that time in graduate school, and I'm a medievalist. This is kind of the age I live in. And so when someone told me this cloth was from the 13th or 14th century, I said, there's no way. There's no way. There's no artistic process. There's nothing that could produce an image that complex in the 21st century. So don't try to convince me that this is a medieval artifact. And it's just never turned me loose. The mystery of this has actually, I think, really ramped up in the last decade, because that radiocarbon dating, I think, is seriously in doubt because of some work done in 2017. So I don't think that there's been a more exciting time to be looking at this cloth since we first learned the complexity of it in the 1980s.
And when you're talking about the early 80s, you're talking about the Stirp team and their initial research. I have that book actually, on the bookshelf back there. It's just, again, of such a fascinating story. I think
Right.
maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's back up a little bit. Tell us
Okay.
what the shroud itself is for people who've
Sure.
never heard of it. And I want to preface it with this question. When you hear people say this is the most studied artifact on Earth, I hear that repeated quite a bit, or people saying there's more
Hmm.
scientific man hours on this or more interdisciplinary research. Is that true to you when you hear that? Does that ring true? I mean, I
Yeah.
know about pyramids and things like that, is that true?
Yeah, I do think that there's truth in it in that, of course, we can't quantify that. I can't tell you how many hundreds of thousands of hours per discipline, but I do think it qualitatively rings true when you look at all of the peer-reviewed science that came out of this. Even in the beginning, in the 1980s, you've got dozens of peer-reviewed articles that appear. And if you look at the field of shroud studies today and see all of the different disciplines represented, I think that it rings true. I know of no other historical or archaeological artifact that has had more science brought to bear on it. You mentioned the pyramids. I think that's an interesting parallel. The structure architecturally probably has been studied more than other structures. But when you speak of true like historical artifacts, I
Mm,
don't know of anything else. Um, so yeah, I think that does ring true.
yeah. And what is the shroud that we're talking about for people who
Right.
aren't
So we're
familiar?
talking about a cloth that is held in Turin, Italy today. So that's therefore its name, Shroud of Turin. It is a 14-foot by approximately 3-foot strip of linen cloth that bears the forensically accurate and anatomically perfect image of a man who has some pretty unique wounds. And really, the image on the cloth is interesting to us, not just because we can't reproduce the formation process, but because the man who's depicted there, this forensic image, is someone who has been scourged with a specific type of weapon that we can reproduce forensically from the wounds. This man has been crucified. He was capped with something thorny on his head something that left over 50 puncture wounds in the scalp and the nape of the neck. And he's been pierced in the right side, right between the fifth and sixth ribs. Again, a forensic wound that we know a lot about. So no one looks at the image on this cloth and says, gee, I wonder who that man is supposed to be. It only fits one person of history. And so that's the reason we're so interested in it, it's so compelling, is the combination of the complexity of the image, but most specifically, there's a person there. There's a
Mhm.
person.
When you tell this story, I think you and I probably agree that this cloth goes back 2,000 years, but
Right.
when you're telling this story to folks, where do you like to start? Because I watched a YouTube lecture you gave recently. I love the sequence that you took us through. I've heard this story told so many times, and I want to kind of open it up to your sequence. Where do you like to begin when you start telling people this story?
So I usually begin with the documented history. And the documented history, of course, is in the 14th century. Um, when the shroud turns up in the possession of a knight named Geoffrey de Charny, who built a collegiate church to put it on display as the burial linen of Christ. So the reason I say documented history is because that's where we can trace, we have a clear chain of custody from today back to that time period. There is, of course, profound historical questions about where the cloth was before 1355. And although historians might not agree on that, I think that when you look to the environmental evidence we have, we know from the pollens we can trace an environmental journey for the cloth. So if you take that and then you begin lining up a possible historical record with the scientific evidence, what emerges is I think something we can put together from Jerusalem to Antioch to Edessa in Turkey, into Constantinople. And then in Constantinople, that's the key date because in 1204, that city was sacked during the Fourth Crusade. And lots of relics disappeared from Constantinople. I've spent a lot of time in the letters of Pope Innocent III, and I can tell you he was horrified when he learned all of the relics that had been taken, the churches that had been looted. So in that environment, Daniel, I think it's very plausible that such an artifact would have disappeared off the historical record because the Pope is excommunicating everyone he can get the name of who's participated in that looting of those churches. So this is, it's true history. You'll read this in the book. There's this true history that's obviously was well documented and well agreed upon. And then there's this era that we really have to put pieces together. And it doesn't make it any less plausible. It just makes it less direct in the record, if that makes any sense.
Sure. So that date you said that we know its chain of custody from is what date?
1355.
1355.
Right.
But of course, there's some really interesting evidence that brings us back further. I'm curious, do you think it's best to talk about that now or continue on our journey?
In whatever order you think so.
Well, I'm curious, there's this idea of the image of Edessa and,
yes,
Ian Wilson's book, The Shroud, really goes deep into that.
Right.
The idea that there's this image that's being shown publicly, historically, that's described quite like the Shroud of Turin folded up.
Very much.
Mainly it's the face being shown, right? I think there's also the fact that it's pretty clear in the artistic evidence that all of these depictions this idea of what Jesus looked like that we've landed on is based on the shroud, and that takes us back much further than that 1355 date as well. And then, of course, you mentioned the Sudarium as well. So could you kind of pick that apart a little bit? Because somebody could hear this and go, okay, well, I heard that the carbon dating said this is around 1300, and then it shows up in 1355, case closed, this is a forgery, let's move on. And it's like, oh, it's not that simple of a story.
Yeah, and it's really not that simple of a story. And when people suggest to me that this is, they'll hear that and then just go, okay, well, I'm done, that's it. You haven't done the intellectual rigor of really looking at the history and the context of this, because anyone who really studies the medieval period at all would know that nothing here lines up. Absolutely nothing lines up.
Something I've talked about over the years is how few wild foods still make it into our global marketplace. Most of us have grown up eating almost exclusively domesticated food products. There's a very unique food still harvested from the wild each year in the US, and that's the black walnut. Not those English walnuts most of us are familiar with. This is America's indigenous walnut, higher in protein than any other tree nut crop. The thing is, not many people eat it anymore. That's why we've turned it into the cleanest protein powder available anywhere in the world. Now, that might sound like a big claim, but think about it for a moment. It's a single ingredient wild protein made with nothing but hand-foraged black walnuts. Rather than the cheap, high-heat expeller press method most companies use to make their protein, we use the ultra-clean CO2 extraction method, the same process the medical cannabis industry uses. If you're looking for a truly clean protein powder that isn't dirty like whey, doesn't cramp your stomach like pea protein, or tastes rancid like hemp, check out Surthrival's award-winning black walnut protein powder. Get yours at surthrival.com.
So you mentioned the image of Edessa, and I think that's a really fascinating connection we can make, is that clearly there's something that's being venerated and in Edessa that is documented in the historical record. It may have been, it sounds like it was a face image only, but that's how the shroud we know was stored. Even into the 16th century, it was in a reliquary that was folded in such a way that only the face was showing. So there seems to have been this tradition of perhaps a devotion to the face. I think the major historical question that begs about the image of Edessa is, well, where did it go? What happened to it? I mean,
this highly venerated image.
Yeah, this thing that shows up in the historical record and in association with a great legend, by the way, that Eusebius of Caesarea reports about the king of Edessa being cured by an image of Christ. But we have this documented record of something that is being venerated as a sacred relic. and lots of discussion around it. It seems to have spawned what became the artistic standard for the way that we understand the image of Christ. We don't even tolerate a deviation from that today, by the way.
Right.
So what happened to it? Well, I believe what happened to it is that we have a record in Constantinople, August 15th of 944. The image of Edessa is received into Constantinople, into the emperor's relic inventory. We have a record of that. So that what's received into Constantinople in 944, isn't that, or couldn't it be the same image that in 1204 disappears from Constantinople? You know, Robert de Clary, who was a knight on the Fourth Crusade, left a beautiful first-person account, what he calls the Conquest of Constantinople, where he describes some of the crusading events. And he says something really interesting. He says, every Friday at the Church of St. Mary de Blacarny, an image of our Lord was stood straight up for the faithful to venerate. What became of that image after the crusade, he says, no one knows, neither Latin nor Greek. Well, what is he referring to? Again, there's this issue of continuity. There's clearly something that Christians have venerated for centuries before 1355 that bore the image of Christ.
And what was the term? There was a term like the tetra something. It referred to a 4-part fold, I believe.
The tetrafold, meaning that that's how the image had been stored in the reliquary. Yeah.
Right. And you know,
those
even
fold
like on my
lines,
shirt right now, you can see the strong fold line right there. Or I've got
that's visible in the 1931 photograph of Giuseppe Henriet. Right. You can see that fold line.
Yeah.
And
So those folds, you can imagine this being folded in such a way. I mean, it's easy to understand because a 14-foot cloth is a lot to try to display all the time. So you could imagine folding it up to what, and I think with the imaging techniques we have now, we're able to see this image so much better.
yes.
But you could imagine kind of like what was the most relevant to people at the time.
Right.
Being to
It would
see
have been
that.
the face.
Yeah.
It would have been the face. You wouldn't have shown the wrist or the knees or the feet. I mean, it's
Right.
the face. And
Yeah.
and that's, it even harkens back to what I think Christians and people of faith, going back to the Judaic tradition, have longed for. The psalmist talks about, we long to see your face.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that made Christ's humanity evident to us.
Right. Wow. And there's this idea too that if we look at old coins, old art, Byzantine type art, all that kind of the old icon art,
Right.
that there's quite a few points that match the shroud, the split in the beard as an example, lines between the eyes, where it's pretty clear once you're walked through this evidence, like, oh, all of the shroud is most likely the standard from which all of that other art. You think that's fair to say of Christ?
I do. I do. I think that a survey, just even a brief, simple survey of art history, would show you that there is, in the earliest depictions of Christ during the time of the Roman Empire, he was depicted as a young Roman man, with short hair, wearing a toga, usually clean shaven, only really identifiable because he's carrying a lamb over his shoulder, like he looks like the Good Shepherd.
Okay.
And those images are in the catacombs of Rome. Well, what's fascinating about that is that after Christianity is no longer persecuted in the Roman Empire, after Constantine's era of the 4th century, you begin to see more, Jesus takes on more Semitic features, more identifiably, radically different features than what you see in those early ones. Well, where did that memory come from? I think that's an important and fair question. How did the first artistic representations of Christ after that era, what are they drawing upon? The Christ Pantocrator image that's in St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai, it's the oldest depiction of Christ existing that we know of that has these uniquely Semitic features and all of the points of congruity with the Shroud of Turin, the swollen right cheek, the hairline,
This, Cheryl, is the famous image that folks might come to mind if I say this, like the face is sort of split down the middle,
yes,
one making two distinctly different faces, essentially,
right.
expressions.
Right. And you can interpret that theologically, as some people have, that there's Christ's humanity depicted and there's Christ's divinity depicted. But there's the other way you can read that is more of a forensic map, because the man's right cheek is clearly swollen.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? And where did that depiction, the idea for that, come from? And how did it become the standard then?
Yeah.
If you fast forward, even if just speaking of artwork, and you fast forward even into the 12th century, are you familiar with the Hungarian Prayer Codex?
No, I don't think
so. This is a manuscript that came out of Hungary. We believe in the year 1189, so the end of the 12th century. And there is a depiction in this manuscript. It's drawn by probably a scribe or a monk, a depiction of the enshrouding of Christ. And that depiction shows a body of Christ that only has 4 fingers on each hand.
Oh, I know the image, yes.
Which is fascinating, because even a medieval monk would have known that Christ had 5 fingers on each hand. But the shroud shows only 4 fingers because of the wound in the wrist, causing the retraction, of the thumb. The medial nerve was damaged in having a spike driven through the hand, so the thumbs retract. Well, how would a monk know that in the 12th century?
Right.
And then there's also the pattern of the weave that's shown in the cloth that they're wrapping him in. It's a 3/1 weave.
Which they show kind of blown up out of proportion, right? Almost to like make sure you understand this is that
to make sure you know.
weave.
Exactly. We see this weave. And having seen the shroud myself, I can tell you that 3/1 herringbone weave is highly visible to the eye, to the naked eye. You don't have to magnify it. You can see it.
Right.
And then, of course, there's the whole thing that the burn holes are there, those L-shaped burn holes.
Right.
Why would a monk draw those if he hadn't seen
very
the shroud?
Distinctly on the shroud and very distinctly in this image. What's this image dated to?
This is, I believe it's 1189.
Okay, so that already inches us back.
Already predates the
carbon dating
date
that was done, which we will get to, that carbon date. I don't hear, by the way, I just want to say briefly for listeners, I don't hear the carbon date brought up as much anymore. I feel like it's sunk in for a lot of people. Maybe you're having a different experience. I just don't hear that brought up. I hear other points of contention, but I feel like that one's losing its potency.
Well, and I think the reason for that might be, and I agree with you, but I think the reason for that might be that anyone who really who's a serious skeptic, and I respect those, I appreciate that. Someone who's a serious skeptic is going to do the intellectual work of studying the science. They're going to soon run into the fact that no one really seriously considers that date as valid anymore. Which we can talk about, but yeah, there's when you begin to, as I said, if you're intellectually honest and you begin to look at all the data points together, it's hard to not be pulled deeper into the mystery.
I mean, if you presented this in a murder case or something, I think you'd be easily convicted with the load of evidence that we're talking about. Maybe we should take a minute and just talk about the image itself. For people who haven't heard about this, I just assumed, like everybody, I just assumed it was painted on there. And then I think a lot of people, when they see it and they go, oh, maybe that isn't paint, they think they're looking at a blood stain or something like that, maybe, or body fluids that made the stain. And it's really, there's so many things that are just mind blowing about the shroud, but I think the image and how it's actually on the linen itself is just absolutely stunning to find out.
Yeah. So the image is actually, if you want to talk about its chemical composition, it sits on the very top fibrils of the linen, so it's less than a micron deep. Now, if you say, "Well, I don't know what that means," a micron, well, it's about 1/50th of a human hair. Okay, so the image is incredibly superficial, which is the great paradox, because then it contains all of this complex forensic information. But the image itself is we know is a result of a dehydration of the cellulose fibers in the linen. Something came into contact with that cloth, some energy, some light, some radiant source that did not burn, but yet caused a chemical reaction in those very top fibrils that captured all of that information. And so it is not a painting. It's not, there's no paint, there's no dye, there's no pigment of any kind to account for the image. It's not a photograph. It's not a bas relief. It's not some artwork. It is actually even more complex than this, is that, of course, we learned in 1898 with the first photograph, we learned that the image is itself a photographic negative. Because when you take a negative of this negative image, you come up with a positive image of the man. We learned in 1976 that there's direct spatial information embedded in the fibers of the linen. So in other words, there is a direct correlation, proportional relationship between the distance the body was from the cloth and the density of the image itself. So you get a map. You have a three-dimensional map of the man's body. I have to tell you, we're already at a point that people should be saying, what?
Yeah.
How?
Can I pick those apart a little bit just because I want to make sure?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
so
Yeah.
the image is, you said less than a micron deep.
Yes.
So every thread of the linen is made of bundles of these fibrils.
Right.
And it's just the top fibrils. So lest someone hears that and think, oh, the top threads only. No, it's the top fibrils in the threads, of which there are
Right.
many in every individual thread. So
Right.
that's very difficult to achieve, because some people have thought, oh, well, maybe you take a metal sculpture of the body, heat it up, and then quickly, touch this linen to it. And it's like, well, that burns the linen. That's been tried quite a bit. The piece about no pigment, no paint, that's because my understanding is the Sturp team thought they were going to get there and be like, right, this is going to take us like half the afternoon. We're going to figure this out right away.
Yeah, we'll figure it out in an hour.
Another piece for me is just how different this is than any medieval art or any ancient art. It doesn't look like anything. It's the idea that this was some one-off, that this painter never did anything again, or this artist, or that this style was never seen again. It's extremely unusual.
Right.
And then I think sometimes this piece about the photograph is it's just so stunning, because I think, like, what would it take for a non-believer? It's like, because the historicity of the biography of Jesus is barely something that can be questioned at this point. I think he's the most well-attested to person from the ancient world.
Absolutely.
So you've got to throw out, like, Alexander the Great. You got to throw out the Caesars if you're not willing to accept the evidence for the life of historicity of Jesus. But I can understand somebody saying, well, okay, I'm fine that he lived, but this idea that he rose again. So it's like, well, what if we had a photograph of the moment that he rose from the dead? Would that do it for you? Because we have that. It's not just a picture of him, but it's like a stunning photograph of his resurrection moment, which is just like, what an opportunity to put your finger in the wounds and prove for yourself. I mean, it's so stunning. But could you tell us that story about that first photograph? I just can't even, when I imagine being in that dark room.
I know.
Well, it's so stunning.
Well, and I think that it's really interesting to me, and now I'm going to venture into the theological just a little bit and say that I've always found it fascinating that the image, the photograph, comes in 1898. Like, we're coming out of a period which historically we call the Enlightenment, the modern era, where we're introducing reason to everything, and we're throwing out all the meta narratives, the big stories of history, and it's all about the evidence. Where is your evidence and where is your proof? The question is no longer, by what authority do you say that? The question now is, where's your evidence? If you're going to make a claim, where's your evidence? It's interesting to me that that's when we get the photograph.
Mm-hmm.
So photography had only been around, about 5 decades at this point in time. And when Secundo Pia, who was an amateur photographer, went to the Savoy family and asked to photograph the shroud, they said, sure. I mean, bear in mind that no one knew. I mean, what you're looking at your shirt, that negative photographic image, no one knew that was there.
Yeah.
for centuries. For centuries. So for the medieval mind, the person who went to venerate this cloth did it because someone in authority told them it was the burial linen of Christ, and they believed it. Well, by 1898, we don't accept that authority anymore. We want to be, we need to see it. We need to, we're the Thomases. Show it to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when we have the image.
Yeah.
So Secundo Pia is the very first one in the world to ever see. Going into the darkroom to process that negative image, can you imagine? Being the first one to ever see, not only is there an image of a man there, but it's forensically perfect. And now you've got all the detail that the naked eye doesn't see on the cloth. It's best seen in its photo negative because the photo negative is actually the positive image.
It's hidden until our time, that's what's so fascinating.
It's hidden. And that's what I love about the word mystery. I say this in all my presentations, that if you look at the Greek word mystery, mysterion, it has a beautiful connotation. A mystery is something that just hasn't been revealed yet. And but it carries the connotation of something eternal. There's always something new that's going to be revealed. And so I love calling the Shroud a mystery for that reason. It's always revealing new things.
All right. So again, for the listener, you see these.
I know, Daniel, this is a lot to unpack.
No, there's just so much there. I just you're the first person I've got to talk to who knows more about this than me. It's very exciting. Okay. Cause I'm obviously just an amateur. I just have an amateur's interest,
right?
But I'm always wanting to talk to people about this. And I've just been really eager for this conversation. It's very nourishing. So the image itself, when you see it, it's not that it isn't impressive, but it's very faint.
Right.
And, kind of takes a little discerning to really understand what you're seeing.
Sure.
Because it's like looking at a negative, and for young people right now, this is got to be like, what are you guys talking about? But
you should have seen me at World Youth Day trying to explain.
Right. But
there is a setting in your iPhone that will do this. You can take any photograph and put it in classic invert setting, and you can explain to a young person what a photo negative is. So,
Cheryl, I carry around this bookmark that is a little replica of the 14 feet of the shroud. So it's got front and back. So again, for listeners, because the shroud wrapped around the body, we have the whole front head to toe and we have the whole back head to toe, or almost.
Right.
So I've got this bookmark that I carry of the actual image, and I always break that thing out, put my phone in classic invert, because
excellent.
When you see it for yourself, it's a rapturous experience the first time because you don't need any special image. You can pull it up right up on your computer and do this with classic invert. You get any image of the shroud, put your phone in that classic invert, which is the negative function.
Right.
You look at this image and you see what he saw.
So isn't that fascinating that you can do it even on your computer? You can do it on any image of the shroud.
Any image. I go around, I pull out all my shroud books, I check them all. It's like, yep.
It brings it out in complete detail. It's mind numbing. Yeah.
Yeah. So, the image itself, if you didn't know that and then you see it in the negative, it's so clear you're looking at a real person at that point, because there's a couple other things out there. I don't want to offend anybody, and I don't know how you feel about these things, but you have images like the Veil of Veronica, or I think they call it the Veil of Manapello.
Manapello. Yeah.
When I look at that looks like an artist's rendering. Yeah. Right.
Sure.
But of course, you have a lot of these objects that are venerated and they have claims of, divine origin or something like that. But a lot of these things, you look at them and you're like, that looks like a painting.
Yeah.
This does not look like a painting. And there's just nothing in its class or category that I've ever seen from that era.
No, there's literally nothing else that I'm aware of that has this incredible scientific complexity to it. Although, I would say that, maybe subject for another discussion would be something like the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, which is also forensically really compelling and interesting. But it's still, even that's not like this. This is
like a photograph.
This captured a moment. And actually, if you don't mind, I'd like to tell the listeners exactly how long this cloth was in contact with whatever the light source was that caused the image.
Before you
We
say
know.
that, I want to talk about this idea of a light source,
Sure.
just because my
Yeah.
understanding is that now I have a background in nutrition and herbalism,
Right.
and one of the things we're always trying to be careful with food is oxidation. So it's like if you get exposure to sunlight and oxygen, things oxidize, and that oxidative process is sort of like what happens with ozone or peroxide. It just breaks things down, and you lose
Mm-hmm.
nutrition really quickly, and it can discolor things as well.
Right.
And my understanding is that these fibrils, because they're not painted, there's no pigment, that the image is essentially like an oxidative process or
It
something
is
like that, right?
a
So,
dehydration. Mm-hmm.
okay, so the idea that is most prominent right now is that it was exposed to like a burst of light
Yes.
from within the body itself,
Yeah.
something like that, right? So I'll pass that to you.
Yeah, because if you look at the shroud, and again for your listeners, if they want, we're just going to look at an image of it, you'll see the frontal image running on one side and the dorsal, the backside running on the other, opposite to each other. And that's because the cloth covered the body. What you also need to realize is that the image, when you're looking at it, the front and the back are on the same side of the cloth. Okay, which means that when this image was created, it's only on those top fibrils. We're talking about a light source that had to have come from within the cloth
Mm-hmm.
because that's the way the image is oriented. So it didn't come from external to the cloth; it came from inside the cloth. And we're talking about a burst of most physicists agree. I've heard words, and I'm not a physicist, but I've heard words used like light, energy, radiant, some sort of an event. Um, but Dr. Paolo Di Lazzaro in 2011 was a physicist working for the Italian Nuclear Energy Association, was very interested in this image and what is working with excimer lasers. And he was curious to know if he could recreate the exact depth of penetration on a linen piece of cloth, not trying to create an image, just trying to discolor it in this same manner, using light that dehydrates the cellulose fibers, takes the moisture out of it, and leaves this image, this discoloration. So he worked with this excimer laser and came up with, and I don't know how many experiments it took before he realized, he got a number, that he could recreate it on a postage stamp size piece of linen. He could discolor it at that exact depth at a pulse of light that is 1/40th billionth of a second.
Okay.
Now, you're talking about carrying around a bookmark with the image on it. I want to put 1/40th billionth of a second on a t-shirt to just have people ask me what it means.
Right.
Because when the human mind we can't even wrap our minds around that.
Yeah.
I mean, I can barely think about a half a second.
Mm-hmm.
1/40th billionth of a second is as close to something like otherworldly that I could think of.
1/40th of a billion.
A billionth of a second.
Okay, so we divide a second into a billion parts, and then we take one of those parts and divide it into 40 parts.
That's
and
exactly
one
right.
Of those parts. How much
and
energy?
Any more, any more than that, and this is all published. I mean, you can go and read Dr. Di Lazzaro's work on this. Any more than that, and you destroy the linen.
Yeah.
Any less than that, and you can't get the discoloration. So that's the number we're talking about. And science can tell us that, mathematics can tell us that, but you haven't even created an image yet. As Paolo says, it would take about 50,000 lasers firing simultaneously to discolor a 14-foot strip of cloth, and you don't have an image yet.
Do you know how many watts of energy were required?
I do not. And I hear that thrown around all the time, that 34 trillion watts or whatever that number is. I don't know that that's scientifically verifiable, so I always kind of stay away from that.
Okay.
I know that's Dr. Di Lazzaro's work with the lasers is probably the best science we have that demonstrates how that image could have gotten there. And we're talking about a pulse of light that can only be produced by a laser in the 21st century.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. So could you talk a little bit about Because when you mention him, it makes me want to hear about the credentials of some of the other scientists who've been involved, because
Right.
this is another area. I remember talking to a scientist friend of mine, and I was explaining how much biblical scholarship has been done. And I think he didn't understand what I was saying, because to him, how could there be, like, he couldn't imagine, to somebody who's not been introduced to even biblical scholarship, like the idea of how many people have put their minds to scripture over the years, like
Right.
it's kind of stunning when you find out. It's like, oh yeah, because people have ideas like, well, I think it's been a game of telephone. It's like, hey, dude, people have been thinking about this for a long time.
Yeah.
Like, you should have and this is sort of similar. Like when I learned about the STURP team, if I understand that correctly, you had like NASA people, MIT people, US Air Force science people. Like these are not all believers. They're not. Some of them were Jewish, which gives them a pretty strong bias against. Right. Could you kind of lay out like what kind of people have been involved in this?
Sure.
It seems like everywhere you turn, everyone's promoting colostrum these days. Endless claims, not just about the effects, but also the sourcing. And I get it, I've been using colostrum daily for almost 2 decades. And I've been in the colostrum industry now for 18 years. Here's what you need to know. Yes, colostrum is all that they say it is, but most of these companies aren't selling you what they tell you they are. They sell a cheap, defatted, fractionated product. They almost never sell whole colostrum, but worse, they sell it in overpriced, tiny amounts to maximize their markup and their advertising budgets. They make money, you get the industry's lowest grade product. Surthrival is different. We sell whole colostrum, never defatted or fractionated, and we sell it in bulk, like our 1 and 2 kilo sizes, because our customers, like me, are serious users. Pound for pound, we've got the very best product at the very best price. So whether you're using it for recovery, as a sophisticated protein powder, for gut health, or immunodevelopment, Surthrival has set the industry standard for colostrum for 18 years running. Find the very best at surthrival.com.
And in beginning with the STURP team, I can just point to a few examples. I mean, Dr. Eric Jumper and Dr. John Jackson both were professors at the Air Force Academy, physicists, who were working with, at the time, with the Jet Propulsion Laboratories to develop some imaging technology, and that's how the VP8 analysis came about in 1976. So these were men who were at the top of their academic fields, and Dr. Jackson, of course, is the one who really spearheaded the 1978 research project. And he, as a nuclear physicist, he is still very much involved in shroud research today. He works on it every single day.
It just gets a hold of people,
huh?
It gets a hold of people, doesn't it?
It gets a hold of people. There was Dr. Ray Rogers, who was a chemist on the team, was with Los Alamos National Laboratories. I mean, he was not even a believer. The documenting photographer, Barry Schwartz, was Jewish. And Barry Schwartz, he's the one who famously tells the story that he took the trip because it was a free trip to Italy, and he thought that he was going to be able to walk up and take a photograph and see the paint. And he died, God rest his soul. He died about a little over a year ago. And he was probably the most active person in the entire Shroud world because he maintained the Shroud.com website.
Which, by the way, I want to say that's where I got, this image here, which is a reproduction of one of his photos. But
yes,
also all of the photos are there for you to see in positive and negative close-ups, full images. I mean, all of that's still at shroud.com, right?
Right. It's probably the largest clearinghouse on the web, I think, to this day. So we're talking about a team of people who were true scientists and true empiricists who wanted to get to the truth. And so, of course, what they ultimately published as their summary statement is that for now, we can only conclude that the image is not a painting or a photograph, that there's no natural process that we can account for the image, so it remains a mystery. That's been the definitive statement that came out of that scientific investigation.
It's stunning. I really recommend people get the original book,
yes.
The report on that. I think it's called, let's see, Shroud of Turin, yeah, like the report on the Shroud of Turin, I think is
Yes.
called.
Yes.
I've got like an original copy. It's stunning because you get to the end and you're like, okay, they can't say it's real because that's not really how they can't say it's Jesus. That wouldn't be science. But they can say this is definitely not a painting, and we don't know how
Right.
it's made, and this is a real person, and this is a crucified man. Um, I can't even imagine what that was like for their peers who are outside of this research, because I'm sure, you see the desire to discredit it after that seems like it was really strong. Could you, I'm curious, what makes the most sense to go into for you next to talk about? I'd love to talk about the blood, but
Yeah.
I'd also like to talk about the carbon dating. So I'll kind of let you decide.
Well, yeah, we can talk about let's talk about the dating, because I think that's, again, it's probably, although it's not as common as what I used to hear, I think that people still are very much informed because it made every headline of every
Yeah.
newspaper. But there were almost immediately some concerns about the heterogeneity of the cloth. Or I should say, is it all the same? Is it all the same kind of material? Because one thing that the STIRT project did, of course, was they photographed the shroud under ultraviolet light. And when you do that, um, you realize that there's an area of the cloth that doesn't look quite like the rest of it. And that's the top left corner. If you're standing it vertically, it's the bottom left corner. But there is an area that does not look like it's the same chemically. So Dr. Ray Rogers noted this, one of the chemists I mentioned, who said that he thought that there was something chemically different about that area of the linen. And he didn't really know what it was, but he knew that there was something about that corner. So it became that, we call it the controversial corner. We know that because of the 1532 fire that happened in Chambéry, France, when the Savoy family owned it, there was a repair of the cloth that took place. The Poor Clares did that. They stitched on a backing cloth. They sewed on triangular shaped patches. And we believe now that they may have well indeed rewoven new fibers into the old linen to strengthen it. They didn't know. They didn't know any better. So that controversial corner, as it's been called, it's always kind of nagged, I think, at shroud scholars. And in 1988, when 3 universities got permission to carbon-14 date the shroud, it was the University of Oxford, the University of Zurich, and the University of Arizona in the United States. They were going to get 6 samples of the linen. Each lab would get 2 samples. They would test, and then they published that result in
Can I just jump
1988.
in? This was meant to be double blind. They were supposed to have a similar linen that they were going to use as a blind control, right? There was a whole series of pretty rigorous protocols that were developed, and I think nearly all of them were violated in this process, right? So like the actual process did not play out the way it was meant to play out.
No, that's true. And there's any number of works out there about this process. Now you could read Joe Marino's book on the carbon-14 dating controversy. It's pretty comprehensive, and I'll talk about the 2017 study that came about that's more recent. But so when these laboratories got the samples and published their results as 1260 to 1390, I think the world stepped back. You know, as I said, it made every major newspaper headline. I think we lost 40 years of opportunity to teach people about this. And the whole sort of mystery surrounding the lack of transparency about the data was very troubling. In 2017, Tristan Casabianca, who is a French lawyer and a recent convert to Christianity, by the way, called up the British Museum to get access to the raw data. The British Museum is the custodian of all the raw data from the 1988 test. And when he asked for the raw data, he was told no. Why? I
Very
mean, why?
scientific.
Why would you deprive the world of knowing the
Yeah.
result of a scientific investigation? You've published the results. So he sued them under the International Freedom of Information Act and forced them to release the data. And what resulted is a pretty damning indictment, because the sample was taken from, guess where?
Controversial corner.
The one area of the linen that everyone knew was chemically different from the rest of the cloth.
And it
So
was
it doesn't.
initially meant to come from multiple locations, right? I mean,
Right.
I understand why you wouldn't want to be cutting, punching pieces out of this, but it wasn't supposed to all come from one place, right? Because they ended up just taking a strip from that corner and distributing it out to the different labs.
They took, instead of taking 6 samples, what they did is they took one sample and cut it into 6 pieces, which is not the same thing. So Tristan published in 2000, actually it was to their credit, it was Oxford University's journal, Archaeometry, that published his work, to their credit. And he pointed out that this is not representative of the linen. This is, you can't trust this date. We know there's something different about this area. We know that chemically, I mean, under light, it fluoresces differently. So I think any serious skeptic would have to look at that and say, okay, maybe good science was not done in 1988.
And I've seen so many of these medieval depictions where the cloth is being shown, because it has quite a history of public showings. I think that's
Yes.
a really cool thing. I mean,
Very well
pilgrims coming
documented.
from
Yes.
all over Europe to see it, right? And you see these images where you've got a line of people there and they're all holding it up and they're gripping those corners real tight, stretching that thing out for these public showings. So you also have just a tremendous amount of organic contamination that would have had happened in those corners. As well. But so the concept is, though, that in addition to that, there's probably a cotton reweaving that took place into that corner.
Yeah.
Something like that.
This is Joe Marino's work that he's done. Again, I reference his work just because I think it's excellent. He and his wife did a lot of research into an invisible reweave technique that was in use in France in the 16th century. And his hypothesis is that there was a reweave that took place in that corner, and it makes sense that there would be something chemically different, because what they would have had to have done if they'd rewoven any new fibers in there is they would have had to have dyed them to make it look like the rest of the cloth.
Right, like sepia toned them somehow.
Again, not knowing
Yeah.
that they were altering the cloth. Yeah.
Right. Oh, I can't imagine being a custodian of this thing, and some of the decisions that have to be made over the years, the fires that it went through, all those kind of
Right.
things.
Right.
You pointed out in the lecture I watched of yours, and I really appreciated this because I hadn't heard anyone say it, but you kind of point out, because they came out with this carbon date with, I would say, a smug attitude. And there's
You have to see the photograph.
Yeah, we'll put that up here so people can see
Yeah.
it. But there's the famous image of those 3 scientists there with the chalkboard behind them, and it says, I think, 1260 to 1390 exclamation point.
Exclamation point.
Yeah, not exactly how we typically do scientific findings.
No, I've always been troubled. Long before Tristan challenged this, I had always been troubled by that photograph, which is the reason I always mention it. Even in the historical method, if I'm writing an objective history, methodology requires me to be objective and not pronounce on opinion or emphasize things. And I think the rigor is even more expected of a scientist. So I've always been very struck by the need to punctuate that. Why did you need to put an exclamation point behind a medieval date if you did not see some implication of the cloth being older than that?
Yeah.
You see, the implication is that the cloth is older than that. Well, we might be talking about the burial linen of Christ.
Mm-hmm. Oh, if this is going to come off as a bit mystic, forgive me, but if I just zoom out and look at the big picture history of this, what starts happening around that era and where our culture is today, it's that exclamation point to me is the hedonism of the time. It's like, oh, good. it's not real. We can party. And then here we are, 2020, about maybe 2024 is when I started to hear this new date that came out of it. And maybe we can talk a little bit about this.
2022, yeah, out of the
Okay.
Italian National Research Council. Yeah.
Right around the time where culturally you start seeing this tremendous return to the churches. Like it's, I feel like in the last few years, things have gotten so out of hand culturally. People are going, okay, wait a sec. So it's really interesting how these two dates frame this period of hedonism that is almost intolerable to the average person. That's just fascinating. But yeah, so I started seeing, it was kind of fun. All of a sudden I'm seeing videos, articles, all this stuff's coming out. New date. It's 2,000 years old. And obviously this, we're in this era where people really jump ahead pretty quick to conclusions. And I know this is, there's still some work to be done, but could you describe a little bit about this more recent dating technique? And also, am I correct in understanding that the Pope has said there's never going to be another carbon dating test done on this?
Yeah, I don't think, well, the last two popes, Benedict XVI and Pope Francis, both refused further testing. I think the door is still open as far as Pope Leo XIV is concerned, but radiocarbon dating is destructive. And so I think that the church does not fear that. I think the church rightfully is concerned about the conservation of the flock.
We don't know how long it's going to be till he comes back. We got to keep this thing intact.
We got to keep it for him. But the new methodology of dating, again, and I'm not a scientist, but I mean, I know just enough to help myself understand that there is a predictive value, and absolute value of a rate of deterioration of cellulose in linen. So in other words, if you have this fixed value, you can take linen comparatively and know the age. You can say, well, if it deteriorates at this fixed rate, then this linen is 100 years old. Then we know that this one must be 500 years old. This one must be 800 years old. So using that kind of methodology, the Italian National Research Council has come up with a date of the first century plus or minus 100 years. There's a window in there. And so I think that methodology holds a lot of promise. I don't know that anyone's ready to pronounce that as an absolute yet, this with the same veracity that they did in 1988, but I do think it's very compelling that newer technologies are pointing to older dates.
Right. Yeah, it's exciting. Let's talk a little bit about the blood, because I think that this is another really compelling component, that there is blood on this. Mm-hmm. One of the cases people will often make is, why would this, if it was a forgery, you have, obviously we talked about the difficulty of even producing this image. I think there still stands a $1 million reward for somebody to produce it, right? And I know there's been a lot of attempts and people have done some pretty far out stuff to try to accomplish this, but still remains to be done. But on top of it, we have the blood. And you could imagine a medieval artist applying blood. You would question whether they would use human blood. If they did, you'd question, just the whole story starts adding up into another compelling piece. So what is the blood on there? Where is the blood? And what does it tell us post-mortem?
So the interesting thing about the blood study is that this is goes back to the early 1980s. Heller and Adler published extensively on this, that, in the beginning, there was no sense that it was even human blood, that it was primate blood. Okay. And, it's forensically accurate, aligning with the wounds. In other words, the exudate that's coming from the wounds is forensically accurate. So we're talking about, if it is blood, if it's primate blood, we're not talking about an orangutan, it's human blood, because that's not an ape that's depicted in the shroud. Right. So this is actually a subject of contemporary discussion among many shroud scholars, is that we go too far when we say that it's human blood. And I'm like, how are we going too far when it's a forensic component of the cloth? And I'm not going to say it's primate blood. It's human blood, because it's a man.
There's chemical markers that put
So,
it in
so
its
Heller and
category.
Adler identified, albumin, hemoglobin,
Yeah.
bilirubin, which is present in very high levels, because bilirubin is something that's produced by the liver in response to extreme physical stress. So, so all of these things point to this being human blood on the shroud. It has been typed as AB. Now, this is another thing that is again, probably have some shroud scholar friends who might hear this and say, I shouldn't be saying that because this is something that is again coming under scrutiny. But but I think that science builds on what it already knows. So we've already established that it is blood because of these components. We've already got a forensic image. We've already got um, a blood type that's been identified. Then I think that anything future we can say about that will only be to enhance that, not to take that away.
Mm.
Um, and I also think that we talked about blood spatter forensics. Looking at this cloth, there's a definite forensic pattern to the flow of the blood, the pooling of the blood in the lower, like the small of the back, that indicates this man was vertical. The blood flow on the arms, I mean, tells us forensically how this man was hanging on a cross.
The
His
blood comes from the wounds, which are in the
right.
carpal bones, and actually runs down like toward, and it drips off the elbow, right?
Right. On the right arm, it does. On the right arm, it flows directly down, straight down. But on the left, it comes off the arm because the left arm was clearly extended in a direct, like 45-degree angle, whereas the right arm was at more like a 45-degree angle
Okay.
directly up. So, I mean, we have all of these forensic data points. And I think the other thing that's fascinating, and this might be a point to talk about is this is a forensic in forensic congruity with that other cloth we talked about, the
Yeah,
one
we'd like to
that's
talk
in
about
Oviedo, Spain. Yeah.
right. So yeah, so I revisited this morning. Just I love that all the gospels, all four gospels, mention this cloth and Joseph of Arimathea and this cloth. It's so cool. And you hear about this face cloth from John that's full.
Only from John.
Right. And the story too, because I can imagine, and I've read this somewhere. I don't remember which book I had read this in, but one might ask, like, well, why wouldn't they have said something about this? But of course they're under persecution. They've got Roman persecution, but also from the Jews of the time too. And the idea of
Right.
having an image of blood, with blood
Right.
on, like this thing wouldn't have been something you could necessarily talk about publicly. But John describes going into the tomb, seeing the cloths and believing.
Believing.
All in one sentence, like he saw the cloths and believed, and you're like, "Ooh, what did he see? What did he see?" But what did he see?
Yeah.
What's this? What's the Sudarium?
So this is something that I talk about also in the book. I'm always fascinated by the fact of what John doesn't say. We read the gospel, every Easter, and John's resurrection narrative is the only one that gives us this detail. But I'm always struck by what he doesn't say. He never says what's not there. He
Right.
only talks about what is, and that what is there is what made him believe. So what is it about the arrangement or the placement or the laying of the burial linen that made him believe?
In other words, you're saying he doesn't say Jesus wasn't
He
there, and
doesn't say Jesus isn't
he says,
there.
"I see the cloths and believe."
He never says
Right.
Jesus isn't there. And although he's responding, of course, to Mary Magdalene's pronouncement that they've taken our
Right.
Lord, but it's fascinating the way he says that. I've often wished he'd been a little more descriptive.
Yeah, oh yeah. I could
Just a
use
little
three or
more.
four more gospels if we could get
But
them.
John is the only one who gives us an interesting detail. He says that he tells us clearly there's the burial linen lying there, and the word that he uses for that in Greek is athonia. So it's a different word than the one he uses when he says, including the cloth that had covered Jesus's head that was rolled up in a separate place by itself. So that other cloth, the word that he uses there is sudarium in Greek, which means sweat cloth.
Mm.
So a sweat cloth would have been a simple piece of cloth that, anyone who worked outside would have had. I mean, you know what it's like to be outside on a hot
Yeah,
day and,
handkerchief.
exactly. Something that probably a man working outside would wrap around his head or have tucked in his belt. So So that cloth, what's purported to be that cloth, is in Oviedo, Spain today. So imagine this. Imagine that you were deposing Jesus from the cross. The first thing anybody would have done in Jewish sensibility, even our sensibility today, would be to cover his face. So someone pressed a cloth into the face to soak up the blood. And remember, it's Passover. It's the Sabbath. They've got to get the body in the tomb before sundown. They're in a hurry. This is the reason the women were going back on Sunday morning. And so you soak up the blood, but now you're enshrouding the body, you're placing the body in the tomb, and you've got this other cloth. Well, it's got blood on it. Under Jewish law, blood is part of the body. It has to go in the tomb. I mean, this is Jewish sensibility. So John's describing really a very technically accurate Jewish burial scene. So this other cloth, this is fascinating because in the year 614, there is a cloth that turns up in Oviedo, Spain, in a religious community there, that's in an ancient reliquary that was purported to have belonged to the Apostle James of Jerusalem, okay? And it's a bloody cloth. And no one really thinks very much about it. I mean, this is the year 614. And it's ahead of the Persian invasions that are coming through the Holy Land, because many Christian relics left Jerusalem during the 7th century for this reason. So today what we know is the Sudarium that's held in Oviedo, Spain. There's like 20 points of forensic congruity between the blood spatter on the Sudarium and blood spatter on the shroud. And if you want
the way that those blood splatters line up show that
they
these
line
are
up.
probably in contact at one point.
They line up. That would have led some forensic experts to say they had to have covered the face of the same man.
Wow.
So I think that, this speaks to the dating issue, because if the cloths came into contact with the face of the same man, if in fact that's forensically demonstrable, then that had to have happened before the year 614. Because we know where that cloth has been since the 7th century.
So that pushes our date back.
Again, it's the contributing scientific and historical disciplines working together that could help build a more accurate picture, you see, of the complexity of this. It's not reducible to a simple carbon date.
Right. John's also gives us the picture of the spear wound, and
right,
there being blood and water, right? So some kind of either
the only one
oral fluid or could be edema that built up in the cardiac sac, but whatever happened there, he describes very distinctly blood and water, and he kind of really drives that point home.
Right.
We see that stain we see water and blood from that wound on the shroud, correct?
Right between the 5th and 6th ribs. It's very visible. There's a separation of blood and clear fluid that some scientists have identified as like a pleural fluid, but it's a clear fluid. And I think we may be going a bit too far if we suggested we know it's a postmortem wound, but definitely there is a separation of blood and fluid there that is quite visible on the shroud, just as John describes in his gospel. And I think that's the other thing that people need to consider when they look at this cloth, is that it doesn't just mirror the gospel accounts. Like, it doesn't just, like, all these wounds that are described in the passion narratives are not, they're all there, but it's more than that. It amplifies the gospels for us, because, we're told that Jesus was scourged, but the gospels don't tell us with what kind of weapon. The gospels don't tell us how many men were involved. There were 2 men beating Jesus. There was one on either side with the same weapon, but one of the men was taller than the other, and we know that from the arc of the wounds. So it kind of amplifies that passion narrative for us, in ways that, if you take these two things separately, you might miss some of that.
Yeah. So we see that double ball bearing kind of wound repeated again and again
Again and again.
scourging, but we see that it's coming from two angles, from two sides, from men of different heights, most likely. And again, kind of confirming the narrative that we read where Pilate has him scourged. Man, you
Right.
think like, because Pilate in the gospel, he wants to let him go. And he's like,
He's
okay, I
trying to,
scourged him. Are we good? And it's like, to me, the idea of being scourged, but I'm not guilty and now you can go free. It's like, oh man, I mean, that's a pretty serious scourging. So, you
yeah,
know, it's pretty, when
Pilate
you
was
see
trying to,
those wounds brought forward in that negative image, it's pretty stunning. I mean, it's
it
like
is.
Mel Gibson's film, right? You're like, that's no joke.
I think actually Mel Gibson's film may go a little bit too far in depicting the sort of the tearing away of the flesh and all that. The Shroud doesn't show us that. The Shroud shows us these wounds, but and many of them bled, but more of a ball bearing, as you mentioned, the ball bearing, a metal like maybe a metal or bone kind of shaped ball, but nothing that would have torn the flesh. We don't have evidence
Right,
of that.
right.
What we do have evidence of, though, interestingly, is that the wounds on the right shoulder are macerated. And you can make out the outline of a rectangular shape on that shoulder, something that broke those wounds down more
You can't
because
make,
this man carried something on that shoulder.
my gosh. So he's carrying the cross, or at least that cross beam
The
of,
patibulum, probably just the
yeah.
crossbeam. Yeah.
Wow. And is it true that on the knees, on the feet, on the nose, that there is soil samples that essentially are from
Yeah.
Jerusalem?
Yeah. Soil was taken from the Shroud, and actually, we learned this may be 20 years old now. We learned that that soil is a specific type of limestone. It's a travertine aragonite that's very common throughout the Middle East. But like all soils, we're now learning, that soils have specific geographic fingerprints.
Right.
And so there was a study that was done in 1986 that showed that this was the closest geographic match for that soil was the old city of Jerusalem.
You just use Occam's razor, and it's like the idea, okay, so you got this, to discount it, you've got to have a medieval forger who has a technique no one's ever seen before, then, or since, that creates this image, but then he uses human blood, but it's not just human blood, it's like Semitic typed blood, and then he gets soil samples from Jerusalem and applies them in all the right places. And that, I mean, all of this starts to get to be too preposterous.
To say nothing of the pollen evidence. I mean,
Could you mention that briefly too? Because that's
so
also,
we have an environmental journey for the Shroud that, again, this is the subject of more study right now. We're sort of looking at this again right now. But Max Fry published in 1973 that he had identified 56 pollens on the Shroud, that 7 of them were unique to the Middle East, and he believed he could place 3 of them specifically only in Jerusalem. That was confirmed by Dr. Danin, Avanan Danin, in I think the late 1980s, and he was a Jewish botanist who said that that the best assemblage of plants placed this 10 to 20 kilometers east and west of Jerusalem at some point in its history. And so now we're looking at pollen again. Obviously, we don't have any new samples to test, but looking at what the previous botanists have done, we're coming up with perhaps a broader distribution of some of those, but still giving us an environmental journey that aligns with what we think we can say about the historical record. So,
including Edessa?
including that area of the Anatolian Peninsula, yes.
Wow.
Maybe not specific to Edessa, but that area. So, again, these are things that in the Shroud world, you'll find different scientists who disagree. So I always encourage people to try to find like the middle ground. Where is the consensus? Something I talk about in my book, not to make another commercial plug, but I do talk about.
There's a lot of
I
Shroud
do,
books out there, so I think it's important
yeah.
to plug your book because there's so many good ones and so many that are like, does that need to be
Well,
written?
mine is primarily more philosophical, and it deals with the question of how do we trust knowledge? What knowledge can we take and say this is true? And I think that there is something profoundly important about consensus. When you find a consensus point, like a place where all the science meets, that's significant.
Yeah.
So I always tell people, look for the consensus. Don't look for the outliers. Don't look for the fringes, but look for what the consensus is telling you.
So if there was like a Venn diagram and you have like the pollen people and the image people and that, where everything overlaps, everyone agrees that the image is not made with pigments, is not made with dyes, is right. Everybody agrees that the image is, and then the other component you talked about before, I want to make sure, I love the 1970s, right? The VP8 image analyzer.
Yeah.
That's so fun. But basically this was a device that I think the military was using for 2D images to try to create relief so that they could get a sense of aerial photography, what the topography was, right? And when applied, my understanding is typical photographs come out distorted and flat, but this rendered a 3D image, which I've seen actually rendered into sculptures and such.
Right. It's a
which
map.
is stunning. And you had mentioned this before, but essentially the darkest areas of the image are what would have been closest, like the nose or the knees or something that are the closest to the fabric. And so you get this 3D rendering away. That's also not really disputed, right? So these are the nature of the image itself is, when we're talking about there being disagreement, we're talking about whether or not these pollen samples are valid or like that. But the image itself is pretty agreed upon.
Yeah, and I it's a broad point of consensus that the image characteristics, there's scientists do agree. I mean, all you have to do is basically look at that 1976 imaging of the VP8, and you realize that when you look at the other study samples, I mean, nothing images like that. Nothing images like that. If you take a picture of the Mona Lisa and you run it through a VP8 analysis, you're going to get a very distorted image because there's no density, there's no dimension to it. It's a painting. It's a flat artwork. What the VP8 analysis told us in 1976 is that the cloth covered a real human form at the time the image was made. That's what it tells us.
Is there anything that can be said about, I remember for a time seeing things like, well, this kind of a weave, this kind of linen wasn't available in the Middle East at the time. And it seems like that's since there's been some that have been found. Is that correct? That, what's that story there? Because one thing we know is that it's pretty clear across all the Gospels. It's Joseph of Arimathea. I believe it's Luke. Is it Mark or Luke that tells us that he purchased it then? Like, so he's a wealthy, probably a member of the Sanhedrin. He's wealthy. He's like kind of a secret follower of Jesus. He asks for the body. He's given it. And that's where this cloth comes from.
We're told, I mean, contextually, that Joseph of Arimathea had a new rock tomb.
Yep.
If he had a new
no body
tomb,
had ever been laid in it.
If he had a new tomb, he owned a shroud. This is a linen that is of such rarity that no one would have gone out and purchased it at 3:00 on a Friday afternoon at the corner market. This was a cloth that was so special and expensive because it was a fine weave. So I think that's another little element to consider is in all of this is Jesus clearly got the worst execution possible under Roman law. Criminals like this didn't receive burials. They were left to rot on a cross, or their bodies were dumped into a mass grave. But this man got a very fine burial. Yeah.
Kind of like the spikenard oil that he gets anointed with.
Yeah, 100 pounds.
Yeah.
It's like, that's mind-blowing.
So when I first learned about all this, I thought to myself, I have to go see it for myself. And then I was found out, okay, in 2025, they're going to show it.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, all right, baby, we're going to
Turin. Yeah.
This is around the time that, like, young people are throwing soup onto Van Goghs and the museums and stuff. And all of a sudden I see like, oh, it's just going to be a virtual showing. And I was like, no. But right now it's not like you can just go see it. So I want to talk about that. And also it sounds like you had a pretty awesome opportunity to see it, which I would like to talk about. But right now it's in Turin and it's in kind of like is it in an argon purged chamber?
Yeah.
No oxygen in exposures to it, and then there's no light, I would assume as well. It's like in a bomb-proof case. I mean, this thing is, because it's had some trauma. There's been fires that miraculously the image is like, I mean, it's pretty stunning. People will see this image of all those triangular patches and it's like somehow he just doesn't get burned, it's stunning.
Right. Right.
What's its state now? And do you think we'll ever get a chance to go see it in person?
Oh gosh, I certainly would hope so. But I have to balance my desire to see it again, and I think everybody should get to see it, against the conservation concerns and preservation concerns. So when it was in the second fire in 1997, I think it really ramped up the awareness on the part of the custodians, that there needed to be a plan for the future. In an age of, global terrorism, and in an age of the 97 fire was deliberately set in the cathedral. I think
to destroy it, or
yes, probably so.
Wow.
And
man, you're right up there with Judas. You make that move. That's
and there's a great story about all of that. There was an off-duty fireman by the name of Mario Trematore, who lived down the street from the cathedral. He literally looked out his window and saw the flames and ran down the street to run into the cathedral. And this is all on a YouTube video, by the way. They captured someone, a news person captured him, I believe, running out of the cathedral with the shroud over his shoulder. At the time, it was in a reliquary that was above the altar in the chapel, and he jumped up on the altar, used an axe to break through what was then bulletproof glass, to reach into the reliquary and just ripped it out, just pulled it out, and ran out of the cathedral with it over his shoulder. And so I think it's that last little footage that's captured by newsmen, but which is why we call him Super Mario, by the way. But
yeah,
but I think it was that event that made the custodians realize that this was a critical concern. And so another thing that's happening is that over the centuries, it's not that the image is getting lighter, it's that the linen itself was getting darker.
Oh, that makes sense. So it's
we're losing the contrast.
Wow.
And so custodians have been very concerned about its exposure to light, its exposure to humidity and temperature. And so it is in a reliquary right now that, well, I think it was designed by NASA. So you could shoot the shroud into outer space and it can re-enter the Earth's atmosphere and not burn up. But
good, just in case.
Just in case. It's never going to be in another fire. And it's in a very stable, neutral environment. They change out the nitrogen gas in it, I think, periodically to keep the environment stable. But the challenge of a public ostension or a public viewing would be its exposure to light and how long it would have to be exposed to light. So you think about, you used to see it hanging vertically, and it can never be hung that way anymore because there's been slippage in the fibers of the linen. So now when I saw it, it's exposed horizontally. So you have to pass in front of it horizontally. And you lose, I think, some of the perspective that way, because that's the other thing about the image is that it disappears in transmitted light. It seems to disappear at certain angles, and you have to be like a certain distance from it to truly see it.
Up close, it's not so clear. Eh? That's what they say.
When you get right up to it, you can't see it anymore. And so I think there's all sorts of concerns about the conservation, and I know people want to see it, and I do think that the answer might be in the future that we can only have digital.
Yeah.
But we'll see. We'll see what this
You got to see it.
Yes, I did.
With Jonathan Rumi, is that true?
No, I did not see it with Jonathan Rumi.
Oh, okay. I thought maybe I misunderstood the story.
No, I did not. I was with a small group of people at an event in 2022 that was part of just a small private showing. And was very privileged to be there for that event, and actually got to see it twice during that visit. And so,
how much time did you have?
Pardon me?
How much time did you have?
Oh my gosh. Enough. People have asked me that. I don't know. I can't tell you. So the first time that I saw it, I do like to tell this story because the first time I saw it, I had a pretty emotional reaction to it. And as you would expect, somebody that studied it as long as I have, and
Finally seeing it.
and to be able to finally see it, and then the second time I was with it was very different. The second time it was like the academic part of me kicked in, and I was like, okay, there's that blood stain, there's that water stain, look at that weave, and I could see the top corner. It was all those things that went through my mind, and it occurred to me afterwards that this is how we're created to know. This is kind of added something to the genesis of my book, by the way, is that those are the two ways we know. We encounter things with our heart, with this sense of knowing that's innate to the human condition that you can't measure empirically. And then there's that more reasoned empirical Thomas moment, right? And the beauty of that is that both of those ways lead us to truth. So,
especially when they coincide,
when they converge. Yes. And that's the other thing I think about this cloth is that I don't know of anything else that challenges us in that philosophical sense. The way this does, it brings both of those ways of knowing together, unlike in a beautiful, perfect nexus, unlike anything else I've ever seen.
Well, I mean, I don't want to say I'm jealous, but I'm excited that you got to do that.
But don't give up hope. I think that, once they figure out some of those conservation issues, hopefully this Pope will allow another public exhibition of it.
Has Pope Leo XIV said anything about the shroud publicly? Has he talked about it?
Only that he wants to visit it. Only that he wants to venerate it.
Oh, he hasn't seen it himself.
He hasn't seen it. And so, but he is the owner. I mean, he's the Holy See. The Holy See owns it, and so I expect he'll make a visit to it.
Just kind of last thing I want to talk about, and then we'll talk about your, where to get your book and all those things. But so yeah, I started off with my first book, and then before I know it, I'm growing this library of Shroud books, and then I'm like, oh, I need to get this picture that's behind me over here. Then I was like, well, I need the life size, and now I'm like, all my friends are joking, when are you buying a life size replica? And I see they're about $2,000. It's not too.
I have one.
Do you have one? Yeah,
I do have one. Yes, sure I do have one.
So I'm seeing that people are going on the road with these and doing exhibition type things.
Yes.
I saw in your bio talking about the Museum of the Bible.
Right.
Are there places that somebody like me who's so excited about this could go and see something? I mean, in Turin, is there something to see? Like what for people who want to go to another level in person?
Yeah. So there is a life-size replica or an exact one-to-one replica that tours in the United States as part of the Athonia exhibits. They have that in several places in the United States. Whenever I travel and I have the space to display it, I take mine, and I chose not to frame mine. I asked people to, and mine was produced in Turin. It's a digital exact one-to-one. It's a photograph of the shroud that Turin produced, and so it is exact. And I asked for people to give me a 14-foot table, and I display mine horizontally because that's how people are going to see it if they ever get to see it.
Yeah.
And so I know that there's an effort on the part of many people in the United States to try to bring this experience to more people. The Museum of the Bible has one that was produced on ancient linen using an ancient weaving technique.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Are they in D.C.? Is that where that is?
They're Washington, D.C., but it is not always on display. I think they plan things around the Lenten Easter season. Okay. But yeah, I do think that you'll see more and more of that sort of thing.
Right. Okay, I actually have one more question, which is, I hear people say a lot, they don't want this to be the linchpin of a person's faith, right?
Yes.
Like,
yes,
you got to leave that, like, for me, there's not much, 0.1%, I'm pretty convinced at this point, but,
right.
Yeah, like, heaven forbid something comes out, oh my gosh, it's not real. Like, you don't want your faith to be hinging on that. But at the same time, I don't know. I'm just curious if you want to speak to that, because to me, it's pretty compelling. And I think that more skeptics would be converted to faith if they understood this personally, then people would lose faith by finding out it wasn't real. Like that.
Yeah, I mean, my colleague, Father Peter Mangum, who I've worked with on this for many, many years, I love what he says. That this is the shroud is as a tool for evangelization in the world we live in, because it speaks so uniquely to faith and science. I always tell people that if I find out tomorrow that the shroud is not authentic, the only thing that changes for me is my travel schedule. You know,
Right.
it's like I don't think we can hang our belief in the resurrection on an object, a physical object. And I think there is a really deep Christian theological reason for that, and it goes back to the earliest Christians. If you look at the apostolic community, you know, it's described in the Acts of the Apostle. It's the charisma, it's the teaching of that early community that emphasizes the resurrection. That's what this metaphysical, supernatural event defined the Christian faith. It's not defined by anything physically left behind.
Mm-hmm.
You don't even find a mention of this in the apostolic community. I mean, I believe it was there. I believe they probably used it, maybe as an altar linen, but they didn't hang their faith on it. And that tells me that we shouldn't either. Because once you begin to elevate something physical over the metaphysical event itself, you're missing the meaning.
Yeah.
You're
That's
missing
kind of
the
idolatry
meaning.
in a sense too, you know?
It is. I think we venerate relics, you know. That'd be a subject for a whole other conversation I'd love to have with Protestants about the teaching about relics, because there's nothing about it that should be superstitious. There's nothing about it that should elevate the physical. It's a conduit to the greatest mystery ever. And that's how we have to approach it.
Yeah, well said. Tell people about where to get your book. Where do you want to send them, and anything else?
It's available on all the major booksellers online, Barnes & Noble, Amazon.com. You can buy it probably in some local booksellers, but it's certainly available online. And it's The Shroud of Turin in the Third Millennium, Confronting the Limits of Human Knowledge. And so that's what I do is I bring us to the point that all the science and all the history and all the biblical scholarship can bring us to, and we hit a wall. You hit a wall because none of that can answer for us the biggest question of all. You're not talking about an object. You're talking about a person.
Yeah.
Who is it? Who is it? And what does he mean?
Yeah. Yes. Oh, this has been a real pleasure for me. I really appreciate
Thank you. This has been fun.
Time today. Thank you so
It's
much.
been a lot
I
of
hope I
fun.
get to meet you sometime in person. Do you you have a tour schedule, I assume, that
I do, and I am recently retired from this is my last semester to teach at LSU, so I'm actually hoping to be able to do a lot more public venues and more education about this in the future than I have in the past. So yeah, I am. You've got an organization or a church group, large group, whatever, and you'd like a presentation with a full-size replica of the shroud.
Okay.
I'm your girl.
How many people do we need to get you over here?
I can't really say and answer that because God sends who he sends. And so,
right. I'm going to be working with God on this one because
I'm not in charge of the invitation list.
Right, great. Well, I really hope that I get to connect with you in person and see your presentation live.
I'd love that.
Well, like I had mentioned to you, I have your book arriving today. I thought I would have it before, but it got kind of delayed in transit. So I will be up the next couple of nights pouring through your book. I couldn't be more excited, and I feel very invigorated from this. So I'm going to be chasing down all of these shroud leads. I have not seen that YouTube video you told me about the rescue effort. So I'll be checking that out as well. And I just hope that people listening and watching go and dig into this a little more deeply, because it is truly one of the most profound mysteries on Earth today. And I think it's so cool that you've made this, such an area of academic focus.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.